It's time to turn to the WUKY Sports Page with your host, Keith Elkins, revealing conversations and stories you thought you knew from prominent Kentucky sports figures. Now, here once again is Keith Elkins.
Ben Chandler is with us today. He served 5 terms in Congress as the representative from Kentucky's 6th District. He is currently the president and chief executive officer of the Foundation for a Healthy Kentucky, and he previously served as executive director of the Kentucky Humanities Council. Before being elected to Congress, he was Kentucky's state auditor and state attorney general. But in his official biography with the Foundation for a Healthy Kentucky, it is noted that he is an avid baseball fan. And Ben's grandfather, A.B. Happy Chandler, was the commissioner of baseball from 1945 to 51, and so Ben had a connection to the game that very few fans will know. Ben, welcome. Great to have you with us.
Wonderful to be with you, Keith, and I'll tell you what, baseball has always been a part of my life and very, very special. It's a special game, I think.
How were you introduced to the game?
Oh, I can't even remember it. From birth, essentially. I mean, I was just involved in it. I played Little League baseball. I remember going to Cincinnati Reds games when I was a kid with my grandfather. I was, I think, 9 or 10 years old when he took me to the All-Star game in Cincinnati, and Pete Rose bowled over Ray Fosse.
Right.
And I was sitting right behind the first base dugout with my elbows on the dugout. So, it's from early on as a child, I was involved with baseball and baseball games. And I remember meeting some of the big baseball stars, people like Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio, Willie Mays, Don Newcomb, Roy Campanella, people like that I met when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. And it was really neat stuff. And as you can well imagine, my grandfather always had a special relationship with the African-American players.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, because he was, of course, during his time as commissioner, 45 to 51 included the breaking of baseball's color barrier by Jackie Robinson in 1947, and certainly we want to talk about that. But Happy's time as commissioner was before you were born, but he lived to the age of 92, passed away in 1991, so he was a big part of your life for a big part of your life.
He died 1 month short of 93,
mm-hmm.
and I had him for 32 years, and I grew up across the street from him. So I did so many things with him. Not only was I named after him, but I was the grandchild who had the most interest in the things that he was interested in. Mm-hmm. I was a big sports fan, and I was a fan of politics. Those were his two main avocations, and we spent a lot of time together. I remember as a kid also growing up virtually in Adolph Rupp's locker room. Mm-hmm. And Rupp wouldn't let anybody in his locker room except my grandfather.
Uh-huh.
And my grandfather, of course, took me along with him. And I'll never forget, as a little kid, 8, 9 years old, looking up at Dan Issel and Mike Pratt, and they were heroic giants mm-hmm. to me at the time. Mm-hmm. And it was just what a wonderful blessing to have had that in your past.
Yeah, he was such a presence at UK games. When I was in school in the early 70s, the students had 2 people that they wanted to greet with a united voice every game. One was Hello Kaywood, and the other one was Hello Happy. And so Happy would stand up and wave, and I'm sure he enjoyed that very much.
I remember those chants very, very well when they would say that. I remember it personally, and I was sitting in the seats with him mm-hmm. when that happened on several occasions. And no, it's wonderful memories, and the students were so good to him.
I was going to ask you about your first visit to a Major League ballpark. I'm guessing that probably occurred before you would even remember it, but what's the first one that you recall?
It was at Crosley Field.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you that. So that dates me a little bit. But Crosley Field was, I'll never forget Crosley Field. It was wonderful. All the ads on the walls, the outfield walls, and mm-hmm. all of that. And I think they had a little rise up on the warning track.
The terrace, they call it.
Yeah, a little terrace on the warning track. That served as the warning track. Mm-hmm. And I remember watching the game. I think one of my favorite players early on at Crosley Field in the first games I went to was Lee May. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you remember Lee May, the
big bopper. Yeah.
Birmingham bopper.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just loved Lee May for some reason. And I was just crestfallen when he was traded in the early 70s for Joe Morgan. And, of course, it turned out to be one of the best trades the Reds ever made. Mm-hmm. It led to them winning it led to the Big Red Machine, really.
Yeah, it was almost like the final piece, not quite the final piece, but one of the major pieces of the puzzle during that time.
Well, and Joe
trade.
Morgan ended up being a good friend of our families, and he and my grandfather were very close. It was very nice.
I was going to ask you, there's so many that you've had an opportunity to meet, but you saw and had your favorite players, but got to meet many of them. Any particular meeting that you recall where you met a player that everybody would know?
Well, one of my favorites was when my grandfather was being honored and it was not Las Vegas, it was in Reno. It was at Caesar's Tahoe. That's where it was. They were having an event honoring him shortly after he was put in the Hall of Fame, and Willie Mays was there.
Yeah.
He showed up, and of course this is timely because Willie Mays just recently passed away, but I'll never forget it because to me Willie Mays was just iconic. You know, he defined what a baseball player should be, and he always seemed to be happy and smiling and a little bit like Ernie Banks, who I also got to meet. But these guys, I just loved them, and Willie Mays was such a nice, decent, good man. Now, the other thing, of course, I remember was when my grandfather was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1982. I had the opportunity to go there, and he was inducted with Hank Aaron and Frank Robinson.
Wow.
So I got to not only meet Hank Aaron and Frank Robinson, but their families as well. And it was, the sort of thing that's a memory of a lifetime.
Mm-hmm. And you got to do that more than most of us did, as far as having that connection, being able to do those things. But it is, and many players I think do recognize this, but it's so important because for many people, it's going to be the only time they get a chance to say hello to somebody like that. And the fact that these guys can be so gracious in most cases is important to baseball fans and to baseball, isn't it?
Well, and I will tell you this, after experiencing that ceremony at Cooperstown, anybody who's a baseball fan and has not been to the Hall of Fame induction is really making a mistake, because exactly what you said, Keith, they have the opportunity to visit. Those are star players in the history of the game, and they make themselves available to the public. You actually have a chance there to visit with some of them, maybe briefly, but you get to meet them and visit with them, and they'll sign balls for you and all of that. It's really a special event.
You were drawn to baseball. You had the obvious connection there and got to see baseball, an inside look. But what drew you to the game? I'm sure you enjoyed playing the game as a kid.
I loved playing the game. I played, of course, Little League baseball, and I made the All-Star team when I was in Little League, and I thought I was right good, and I always wanted to be a Major League Baseball player. I thought there was nothing better to do with your life than to be a Major League Baseball player. And then late in my, when I was about ready to go up to what they then call Pony League, I ran into the curveball. And the curveball has been a graveyard, I think, for many an aspiring baseball player. But I just couldn't hit the curveball. Maybe I could have if I'd stuck at it long enough, but I couldn't hit the curveball, and I took up tennis instead.
Yeah, that curveball has derailed a lot of our fantasy careers, hasn't it?
I think so. And actually, Tom Verducci, who you probably are familiar with, he's a baseball writer, national baseball columnist. Right. He wrote an article for Sports Illustrated about the curveball and quoted my story in it.
Well, that's a marker for your career there. Then when the curveball came along, but it has derailed a lot of careers, no doubt. But we all had such fun playing the game at that time, and then a lot of times we play as kids, and then maybe the interest doesn't last. But for some of us, it lasts a lifetime, and clearly it has for you.
Well, it has lasted a lifetime for me, and. As a matter of fact, myself and some of my friends who I went to law school with started one of the first rotisserie baseball leagues in central Kentucky, and we started it in 1986, I believe. So it's almost 40 years in existence, our rotisserie league. So we were early in the game of what is now mostly referred to as fantasy baseball. Mm-hmm. But what really is fun about that is it keeps you involved in all of the players in the game. And right now, I can give you general idea what all the statistics are for every baseball player.
And you have a lot more statistics to look at than you used to have.
Well, you really do. Now, I still don't really understand what some of the new statistics are, like WAR, for instance. I've not gotten my head around how that's calculated. But, yeah, they've got a whole lot more in the way of statistics now than they used to. But what that tells you, my interest in all of that is it tells you that my head is quite full of a lot of I think maybe useless information.
Well, people say it's useless, but we have a lot of fun with it.
Fun,
sure.
I could tell you I have an enormous amount of fun with it.
Yeah, there are a lot of those new categories of statistics that I think are hard to get your head around, because we know a 300 hitter, we know 30 home runs, we know 100 RBIs, and 20 game winners for pitchers, or a ERA under 2 or something. But some of these things are a little hard to, when they say they allow for ballpark conditions or ballpark layouts or something like that. It's really hard to get hold of that.
Well, it really is, and particularly for old guys like me. Yeah. I'm getting ready to go on Medicare, and
been there. I know for a while. It's a good system.
Well, good. I'm all for it. But when you get up to this age, you're used to what you're used to, and you don't adapt quite as much. And boy, they've got a lot of new terms and a lot of new statistics that they're able to crunch now that I just cannot seem to, again, get my head around. And they even have new pitches like the sweeper.
The sweeper.
That's
the first time I heard of that. What are they talking about?
Well, and I'm not sure it's a whole lot different than a slider, but they say it is.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some kind of in between in there, between sliders and curves, and it's now a sweeper. That's the term that's in vogue right now. So we'll hear that one for a while.
Well, we will, and I wonder about some of the announcers, how they can tell the difference when they're in the booth between a sweeper and a slider.
Yeah.
How you go, oh, he threw a sweeper. Well, how can you tell?
I think that you just have to say it decisively. I think, as though you actually know, because that's in my experience in doing minor league baseball, it is difficult to sometimes even identify the difference between a fastball and a slider, or a slider and a curve. You have a little bit of break, but not a lot, and you check the speed. But then you work in something else like the sweeper or the sinker or other things. And I think a lot of times that when I hear an announcer decisively say that was a sinker, that was a sweeper, I'm not sure he actually knows. There was one of my broadcasting colleagues in minor league baseball said that occasionally you'd have to do a game in front of a really small crowd. So sometimes your play-by-play would project out over the field because there weren't many people around to make much noise. And he called a strike 3 on a slider, and as the pitcher was walking off toward the dugout, he said, that was a curve. So he hollered up toward the press box and let him know. So
that's very.
It might have been
funny.
The other way around on the pitches, but at any rate, the pitcher had to identify it, and so I think sometimes that may be a little more decisive announcing than maybe there.
So
should
at
be.
Least I meant it to be a curve.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Sometimes they don't turn out how you intend them to, and those pitches tend to travel a long way, don't they? I wanted to ask you, and we talked a little bit about you playing as a child, as many of us did, but you also got a chance to play as an adult in a big league ballpark.
Well, and this was just really great, because when I got to Congress, I had no idea that they had this thing called the Congressional baseball game, and now they even televise it on ESPN. It's a little bit amusing to watch, frankly, because there's a bunch of old guys running around trying to play baseball in a major league park. But I was the starting shortstop for the Democrats, and that's a testament, I think, to how poor the team was. But if they had put me at shortstop, that left a lot to be desired. But it was a wonderful, wonderful thing for me, because a little kid, with a dream to play Major League Baseball, who never made it, all of a sudden finds himself standing out on the diamond in a Major League Baseball stadium with fans actually in the stands, and some guy trying to throw a pitch past you.
Right.
It's in my last game I went 3 for 3.
Well, great.
And laid down the best bunt that you have ever seen.
That's a rare skill these days.
Oh, it is these days. But this one was just beautiful. I hit it up the third. I bat left-handed. I hit it up the third base line and had enough backspin on it. It went about halfway up the line in the air and just died. It hit the grass and just died. I couldn't do it again if my life depended on it.
But you were Rod Carew for that one at bat.
Who was one of my heroes, by the way.
I was going to ask you about. We'll go back to Happy's time as commissioner, and it was a 6-year period, his tenure there, 45 to 51, and what a significant era that was in baseball. It included, of course, the integration of baseball when Jackie Robinson joined the Dodgers in 1947. The commissioner had to approve the transfer of his contract, Jackie Robinson's contract, to the Dodgers from the minor league team in Montreal. What did your grandfather ever share with you about that period of time?
He shared a lot with me about it, and one of the things that he shared, exactly what you said, is that the commissioner had to approve the contract. So whatever anybody says about who gets credit for it or not, the commissioner had a decision to make, and he could have not approved the contract or approved it. And the fact was that his predecessor, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, let it be known in no uncertain terms that he was not going to approve any kind of contract that was given to a black player. And my grandfather, when he was elected commissioner, he said, these young men have fought. I've seen, he was on the Military Affairs Committee during World War II. He said, I've seen young black citizens of this country, men, fight and give their lives for this country, and it's hard for me to see that it's right for them not to be able to play the national pastime. If they're prepared to give their life for the country, why can't they play the national pastime? And he made a famous quote that in the movie 42 they put in the mouth of Harrison Ford, which I wasn't real excited about, but his quote was, "Someday I'm going to have to meet my maker, and if I say that I didn't let this young man play because of the color of his skin, that might be an insufficient answer."
Right.
And I heard him give that quote many times.
Many times, yes.
Yeah, and then they put it in Branch Rickey's character's mouth in the movie. Just goes to show you the facts are not terribly important to Hollywood.
Well, sometimes, the story comes first, I guess, and then the facts. But,
that's right.
But he did say that, and he did do that, and when I look back on that,
you probably remember it yourself, him using that.
Oh yes,
quote.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you didn't have to be around Happy Chandler very long before you would start into that story. If baseball came up at all, he was always glad to share that story. He shared a lot of stories, of course, but he was particularly glad to share that one.
Well, he was very proud of it, and very proud of and the voters the owners had voted 15-1 against letting Robinson play, and he sided with the one, and he was very proud of that too. Now, he was a politician, and you got to remember what the times were like back then, not like they are today. And it's not perfect by any means today, but back then this was a pretty segregated society, and for that decision to be made in 1947 was really very unpopular amongst a good segment of the white population in this country. So my grandfather didn't trumpet it back then, being the good politician that he was. And when it came time that he wanted to take credit for it, it was a little too late.
Yeah, yeah. And to put some perspective on it, I've heard a number of people point out that the integration of baseball came before the Brown versus Board
7 years before.
Yes, 7 years before. And again, for those who may not know a whole lot about the society at the time, baseball was far and away the most popular sport, and Jackie Robinson's integration of baseball was a huge story for baseball and for the society. I always felt like Happy Chandler. There were many big moments in his life, but there he was ready for the big moment, and he did what he did because, as he put it, it was doing the right thing, and that's the way he came to his decision. Apparently.
Well, and I think in retrospect, that really was the most important decision, probably from a cultural standpoint, that he ever had to make in his career, because you're exactly right. The game of baseball was, in fact, the national pastime. Now, it's called itself that for a long time, and it's been eclipsed in many respects by basketball and football. But back in the 1940s, they weren't really a threat to baseball. I mean, baseball was far and away the most popular sport. Every citizen in the country was aware of it. So any important move made relative to baseball like this, a game-changing move like this, was it would change the culture. That's how important it was. This was a big change in the American culture. For the better.
Yeah.
I think all of us can agree to that now.
Yeah, and of course, many other players, once the barrier was broken, then things began to open up, although it did take a while for some teams to have black players.
Well, I'll tell you, the other thing that's I thought interesting about this, of course, there were some players who got a lot of publicity for resisting it. I think the manager of the Phillies and there were some players even on the Dodgers. I think Dixie Walker had a thing or two to say about it. But there were a number of players throughout the league who did not like it, and some of them were prepared and said that they were going to cause Robinson some trouble when he came to town. Well, my grandfather had a fella, and I love this story because it has a local connection. He had a well-known fella in Kentucky named Frenchie DeMoisy, who was his right-hand man. And Frenchie was 6'7". He was an All-American for Adolph Rupp. His banner, his jersey hangs in Rupp Arena right now.
This is back in the 30s, right?
Back in the
he played in the 30s.
Yeah, he played in the 30s, and this was the 40s, of course, the late 40s. But he drove my grandfather. He was his right-hand man, and my grandfather employed him in the commissioner's office. And as I say, Frenchie was 6'7". By the time the 1940s came around, he probably weighed in the neighborhood of 350 pounds, but he was very athletic. And my grandfather sent him around to these different cities to visit with the players about Robinson. If there was ever any kind of if anybody gave any impression that they were going to cause any trouble, they had a visit from Frenchie. And I can tell you, when they visited with Frenchie, they were not going to get the best of it.
Yeah, they would remember that visit.
They really would.
Did you ever, Jackie Robinson passed away in 1972, I believe. Did you ever get to meet him?
I did not meet him, but I met his wife on a couple of occasions. Just a lovely, gracious woman. I met her at one of the Congressional baseball games and had a picture taken with her and my son. And I'd also met her several years before when they did a Jackie Robinson stamp, when the post office did, and they came to the cabin on the back of my grandfather's property and did the stamp ceremony there.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about the cabin, because that has become rather famous in association with Happy Chandler.
Yeah, well, it was a cabin that was built in the 1930s in connection with his service as governor, and he had a whole lot of different things happen in that cabin over the years. A lot of his political meetings were held there. It was a guest house, essentially, in the backyard, and a lot of very famous guests stayed there over the years. I remember people like Bob Hope and Chuck Norris and just a whole manner of people who stayed in that cabin. But in 1947, Branch Rickey came to visit, and he and my grandfather sat in that cabin and sat on either side of a desk that I've now got in my house and made the decision together to put Jackie Robinson in. Basically, Rickey said to my grandfather, he said, "Now, Commissioner, I very much want to do this, but I can't do it without you. I've got to have your support because, we've got a lot of opposition." And that was when my grandfather indicated to Rickey that he would indeed support the move. So it's really a very important moment in the history of the Robinson decision.
Well, that was certainly the most momentous and historic decision that he faced as baseball commissioner. But he also had another issue that he oversaw that resulted in a player pension being established for the first time. And I guess he was involved in packaging some broadcasting rights, which was an early example of doing it. Maybe the first example.
It was the first.
Yeah,
he was the
that.
pioneer of broadcasting Major League Baseball games, and he used that broadcasting money to set up the baseball players' pension. And that was really important to him because there was a very famous Hall of Famer named Grover Cleveland Alexander, who was a great pitcher. And my grandfather remembered watching Grover Cleveland Alexander barnstorm in order to make ends meet after his career was over. And he was really kind of down and out and not even able to hardly support himself. And this is a guy, again, who was a good enough player to be named into the Hall of Fame. So he decided, under these circumstances, I've got to create this pension plan. It's just absolutely important to take care of these guys when they can no longer play. Now, this was when players weren't making much. Right. It's a whole different thing, than it is today.
Sure.
These players, I can remember myself in around 1977 when Harmon Killebrew, who's also in the Hall of Fame, got his first $100,000 a year contract.
Yeah.
And the minimum for guys who can't even hit 200, the minimum is like 800,000 or something like that.
It's well above $500,000 now. That's right.
That's
and
right.
Yeah, so you had players making. A lot of players made less than five figures, much less six. Pete Rose at the height of his career was talking about wanting to become the first $100,000 singles hitter.
Right.
And there's Jim Bouton, who wrote the book Ball 4 about the 1969 season, talked about some of his early salary disputes with the Yankees when he was first coming up and was a pretty hot pitching prospect, and he would talk about asking for $12,000 and being offered $9,000 and holding out to get $10,500 and that sort of thing. These numbers seem. Now that's a couple of innings worth of work.
Well, that's exactly right. Starting pitchers, there are quite a number of starting pitchers who make over $1 million for every start. It really is just astonishing the difference between now and back then.
Yes.
And as I say about the Killebrew thing, I just remember that because I thought, here is one of the greatest players. He was fifth all time in home runs for a while, and clearly a Hall of Famer. He was well into his career. Almost toward the end of it when he made, for the first time, $100,000 a year, and that's just peanuts now.
Yeah, exactly. And the pension was such a big step too, because as you say, the baseball salaries were very small. Most guys went home and worked another job, and sometimes not a particularly great job, but might even labor type work over the winter until it was time to go to spring training again. And then they would come to the end of their baseball careers, A, not having made much money, and B, having nothing to plan for their future. Now you can say, well, they can do some of that on their own, and they could do some of that on their own, but baseball owed them something. Yeah.
Well, it did owe them something. I don't think there's any question about it. And it's hard, to make a lot of money when you're not being paid well for a career that isn't even an annual. This was a 6-month, 7-8-month deal.
Right.
So you didn't even get a full year out of it as an employee. And the players had no bargaining position at all, no bargaining power, because the owners had complete control over them. And that's why the Curt Flood, Andy Messerschmidt deal, when they broke that loose, just made all the difference in the world for the players.
Right. They suddenly were being paid closer to market value, and
because they had the freedom to move to another team, which they didn't have before.
Yeah, they had the leverage. The pension was, I guess, maybe the first breakthrough on the behalf of player rights, you might say. And then it was many years later, 1970 or so, before Curt Flood challenged that, and then in the mid-'70s before it actually came about that they could move from one team or another after fulfilling their contract. But the pension was a huge step.
Well, Tom Yawkey was the owner of the Boston Red Sox, one of the well-known owners, and he was quoted as saying back in those days that Chandler was the players commissioner, the fans commissioner, the umpires commissioner, everybody's commissioner except the people who pay his salary, the owners.
The owners, right.
Which is why he only, generally speaking, served 6 years. They did not re-up his contract after that amount of time, and it's when you look back on it, when you needed 75% of them to get your contract renewed, it's not surprising that happened.
Right. And so he ended up leaving the position in 1951. I guess he had tried to get a contract extension for a couple of years, but they never could work that out. And again, acquiring the reputation of the players commissioner was probably not a positive step in terms of dealing with the owners. But on the other hand, he was doing what he thought was right.
Well, that's right, and I think he'll be remembered for that, and I think it's one of the reasons he's in the Hall of Fame. Mm-hmm. But he had to get – there were 16 teams at the time, and you had to have 75% of the vote, which means he needed 12 votes in order to get his contract renewed. And he very much wanted to have his contract renewed. So he tried to get it, and the best he could do at any one time was get to 11. He needed to get to 12, and he got to 11. Finally, when they had the formal vote, he only had 9 because I think a couple of them saw which way the wind was blowing. But at no point in time did he have a minority of the owners. Even when they refused to renew his contract, he still had a majority support.
Mm-hmm. Did he share with you just general thoughts on being commissioner of baseball, not just those specific issues, but just general thoughts on being commissioner of baseball, how much he might have enjoyed it or maybe some of the things that he didn't enjoy?
Well, I think I don't think there's any question that he enjoyed it. One of the things he used to talk about was how important he felt like the minor leagues were. And he really spent a lot of time traveling all over the country, going to different minor league towns and ballparks, trying to support and build up support for the minor leagues, because he felt like that was important to the support for the sport down to the grassroots. And it was just a great piece of Americana, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So he loved the minor leagues. And he loved, I think, being around the players because he was a jock. I mean, I don't mind telling you, even though he was a politician and he served as governor of the state twice, he was down deep a jock. Mm-hmm. He was, when he went to Transylvania University as a young man, he played on the basketball, football, and baseball teams. And another thing that's interesting, I think, is that his favorite sport wasn't even baseball. His favorite sport was football. And he was actually a football coach and still has the winningest record at Versailles High as a football coach. Yeah. And he wanted, in his career goal was to become football coach at Center College. And he applied for it, and they didn't give it to him, which is why he went into politics. And then, of course, later became baseball commissioner. But he was down deep. He just loved sports, all about sports. Basketball, football, baseball, you name it.
You mentioned center football, and wasn't he involved in the scouting ahead of the Center Harvard game? And this game, to this day, is thought of as one of the great upsets, maybe the greatest upset in the history of college football. Center beat Harvard, which was a powerhouse. This was, 1920 or 21?
1921, I think.
And so what was his
Well,
role?
Of course, it was Center 6, Harvard nothing. Mm-hmm. And the game was played up at Harvard. Harvard at that time was the Alabama of college football. I mean, it was the powerhouse in college football.
The original Crimson Tide.
That's exactly right. Interesting that they both had the name Crimson. Mm-hmm. But Harvard, for whatever reason, they had a series of games with Center, and Center had lost a couple of them. And my grandfather happened to be up at Harvard Law School studying at the time. And they asked him, because he had helped coach the team prior to that, they asked him to do some scouting up there at Harvard for that game. And he scouted the Harvard team, got the information back to the Center team, attended the game, sang My Old Kentucky Home in the locker room, and carried the game ball off the field. Wow. After it was over. And he and Bo McMillan were great friends, and the two main stars of the Center team, Bo McMillan and Red Roberts, ended up both serving in one of his gubernatorial administrations.
Yeah. So he's been around a lot of highlights if you look back through Happy Sanders.
Well, it's really quite a remarkable life if you think about it. And it amazes me that there has never been a biography written about him.
Oh, that's a biography and a movie, too. That should be both of those things. Yeah, that
It's a
would be
lot of
interesting
stuff.
to see. Yeah, what a personality he was. I remember seeing some film. I think it might have. Well, I don't know if it was from the Ken Burns thing or not, but he's on the field during the like the mid '70s at Riverfront, and he looked. Of course, he was always at home with people, but he looked especially at home on the baseball field and greeting baseball people.
Just loved it. And now another story that I remember, which I always made an impression on me, is shortly after he became commissioner. Well, it was maybe a couple of years after he'd become commissioner. He held a ceremony in Yankee Stadium at the beginning of the 1947 season, a tribute to Babe Ruth. And there are lots of pictures. You can Google it on the internet right now, and you'll see pictures of him and Babe Ruth standing there on Babe Ruth Day. Mm-hmm. And he had proclaimed it Babe Ruth Day. At that time, Yankee Stadium held 77,000 people. And it was packed, of course, Babe Ruth Day.
Yeah.
And this was toward the end of Ruth's life, and they were honoring him. So it was packed. And when my grandfather got up to speak, he had just, a few days earlier, fired Leo Durocher. And that was received negatively by a lot of fans. And he said that when he got up to speak, he was booed by 77,000 fans. He said he got a standing boo at Yankee Stadium. And he said that was, he didn't like it a whole lot, as you can imagine at the time. But he said, once you've been booed by 77,000 people, not a whole lot gets your attention after that. If anything negative happened later, he said, I don't care about that. I've been booed by 77,000 people in Yankee Stadium.
He had a thick skin, but it was made thicker that day.
And no question about it.
Well, let me ask you, you're getting ready to retire as President and Chief Executive Officer of the Foundation for a Healthy Kentucky, and I would assume that means maybe even a little more baseball in your life after you've got some free time?
I sure hope so. And in fact, I've threatened to figure out a way to do some road trips and go to all of the baseball stadiums that I haven't been to. I've been to a number of them, but I'd love to do that, drive across the country and just go to ball games. This year, I went out to Arizona for spring training for the first time. Mm-hmm. I've been to Florida spring trainings, but I'd never been to Arizona, so that was a lot of fun. Lots of boxes still to check off, Keith.
Right. Well, that's good, and I hope you have a long, long time to do them, and we certainly do appreciate your time doing this today. It's been a pleasure to talk baseball with you.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it very much.
All right. Thank you.
You've been listening to the WUKY Sports Page with your host, Keith Elkins, an exclusive podcast from 91.3 WUKY, produced at the WUKY studios by Alan Lytle. Our theme music is Peanut Butter and Jam by Illogical Bit, available at soundcloud.com/illogicalbit. Subscribe to the Sports Page through iTunes, Google Play, or at our website, WUKY.org.